Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the story of the United States, but it's more than just a timeline of presidents and wars.
Right.
It's a sprawling saga. It's built on hope, on fierce resistance, profound and, frankly, agonizing contradiction. It's a land that has been constantly battling for its own soul, really since the very beginning.
To really understand that saga, you have to transport yourself back to that turning point, 1492. Imagine those three small ships, the Santa Maria, Pinta, and the Nina, gliding across this unknown ocean.
It's an almost unimaginable shift in destiny.
It is. At that moment, very few people in Europe could have possibly known that this one small fleet would fundamentally change the course of an entire continent. A continent that had been self-sufficient, sophisticated, and densely populated for millennia.
Exactly. Our mission today is to trace this journey from its complex, contradictory beginnings. And crucially, we're going to start long before Columbus or the Pilgrims. We're going to explore how this immense geographical expanse, forged in a collision of cultures and ideals, grew into the global superpower it is today.
And we have to pull all the threads together.
All of them. The vibrant indigenous civilizations that were destroyed, the freedom-seeking immigrants who built the nation, the ruthless commercial exploitation that dominated the economy.
And the tens of thousands who suffered in bondage that fueled it all. It's a history that requires us to look unflinchingly at the good and, well, the terrible.
It's a story written in blood, sweat, and tear stains, but it's also one driven by this unprecedented human hunger for reinvention and self-determination.
So let's unpack the true starting point.
When most people begin American history, they instinctively start in 1492. But our sources are really emphatic about this. That's a huge omission.
A massive one.
If we truly want to understand the origins of this nation, we have to recognize the rich, deep, and complex history that existed long before the first European glance westward.
That's where the true beginning lies. We're talking 14,000 to 10,000 years ago. When the first inhabitants migrated across the Bering Land Bridge that connected Asia and America, so by the time Columbus arrived, North America was absolutely not an empty wilderness just waiting to be settled.
No, it was a bustling, lively geography.
Hosting an estimated 8 million Native Americans.
And it's so crucial to understand they were not one single group. They were this stunning mosaic, hundreds of different tribes, different languages, different cultures, each adapting to their environment in just brilliant ways.
And their adaptation required immense intellectual and, frankly, engineering sophistication. We often oversimplify the history here.
We do.
Consider the extremes. Up in the West, you have Eskimo communities who were marine hunting experts. They were using large boats crafted from walrus skin umiaks to hunt whales in the open ocean.
Incredible.
Meanwhile, you go down to the resource-rich Pacific Northwest, and the tribes there had developed these extremely clever, sophisticated traps and weirs specifically for fishing the massive salmon runs in their rivers.
This speaks to a profound understanding of their local ecology, right?
Yeah.
They weren't just reacting to nature.
No, they were actively managing it, shaping it. Our sources highlight their use of controlled fire, not just for warmth, but skillfully.
What, clear forests for agriculture?
Exactly. And to direct the migration paths of game. This suggests a complex, long-term environmental stewardship.
And if you want the absolute apex of ancient American engineering, you have to look to the Southwest.
Oh, the Hohokam civilization in the Sonora Desert.
In a desert.
They managed to survive and thrive by constructing this massive, intricate network of canals. I mean, it's a truly astonishing feat of water management, designed purely to irrigate their crops across an arid landscape.
But the most structured, most complex civilization encountered by the Europeans was, without a doubt, the Aztecs in modern-day Mexico. Their capital, Tenochtitlan. It was revolutionary.
It was magnificent. The city was larger and far more organized than virtually any contemporary city in Europe.
That's amazing.
Imagine a city just crisscrossed by canals with impressive public amenities like vast zoos and botanical gardens. The Aztecs were astronomers, poets, artists. They built an extraordinary culture that rivaled the heights of Renaissance Europe in so many ways.
Yet, the sources also mandate that we recognize the contradiction within their own society. Alongside all that artistic and astronomical brilliance was the tragic and dark tradition of human sacrifice. It reminds us that complexity, beauty, and darkness existed simultaneously in pre-Columbian America.
Just as it did across the ocean in Europe, absolutely. And all of this incredible, vibrant history was about to be obliterated.
In Columbus's arrival in October 1492, Well, it wasn't an accident.
Not at all. It was fueled by the powerful consuming desire of 15th century Europe for wealth and power, specifically new trade routes to the east.
Right, because the overland routes for spices, silk, all those valuable goods were either too dangerous
Or controlled by the massive power of the Ottoman Empire. Europe desperately needed a seagoing alternative.
the drive for fame and instant fortune was intense.
Even if Columbus's actual fleet was pretty modest compared to other contemporary explorations, like the famous Chinese treasure fleets.
And at first, Columbus described the natives as amicable, gentle.
He did, but his journals reveal a deeply colonial, extractive mindset. His true goal was immediate wealth gold, and his assessment was that the native population could be easily managed and put to work.
Chilling.
His return to Spain with these tales of both riches and seemingly peaceable natives, well, that fueled a massive influx of Europeans, all driven purely by the dream of instant economic mobility.
And that takes us to the true force of the collision, the deadliest weapon brought by the Europeans.
And it wasn't the steel swords, the gunpowder, or the ships, as effective as those tools were in direct combat.
The deadliest enemy was invisible.
It was the viruses: smallpox, plague, measles, typhus. These diseases had ravaged Europe for centuries, granting the survivors at least some partial immunity.
But the indigenous populations of the Americas had no such history of exposure.
Zero immunity. For them, contact was a biological apocalypse.
The scale of this disaster is, it's almost impossible to comprehend today.
It is. The estimates suggest that due to conquest, forced labor, and primarily these epidemics, somewhere between 50 and 90 million people died across Central and South America.
50 to 90 million.
This is unequivocally one of the greatest and most profound demographic catastrophes in the history of humankind.
That human cost is made so tragically visceral by the accounts from Tenochtitlan.
The epidemics were so overwhelmingly swift and lethal that the city it couldn't bury its dead. Houses were deliberately pulled down over the bodies inside, serving as vast, informal mass graves.
And think about the strategic implication of that.
Oh, absolutely. Hernan Cortez conquered a massive city of over 100,000 people, primarily because the population had already been ravaged and broken by biological agents they couldn't even see.
This tragic beginning, this dream of building a new life, set directly against the reality of destroying a life that already existed. It lays the contradictory foundation for the entire American story.
As colonization advanced, we start to see the Spanish and the English pursuing these fundamentally different approaches.
Although both were rooted in exploitation.
Absolutely. The Spanish were primarily interested in extraction and conquest. The English, on the other hand, were focused on commercial profit and separately on religious freedom.
Let's focus first on Spain. Their mindset was purely extractive. After his second voyage, Columbus began sending Native Americans back to Spain as slaves.
And the system they established was immediate and brutal. Every single Spanish colonist was entitled to forced native labor to serve their needs. Their conquest was relentless, often based on these unsubstantiated native legends of gold.
Which drove figures like Cortez deeper and deeper into the interior.
And this relentless greed defined their actions. Even these paradoxical moments of potential coexistence were just violently rejected.
You're talking about Cabeza de Vaca.
Exactly. The fascinating figure of Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, a Spanish explorer who was enslaved by Native Americans. He learned their culture, their healing methods. He lived among them for years.
And for a brief, shining moment, he actually envisioned a world where Spanish and Native peoples could coexist peacefully. He thought he could use his knowledge to bridge that cultural gap.
And his dream was immediately crushed. When he was finally recovered by other Spanish forces, what were they?
Slave hunters.
Slave hunters. They were entirely uninterested in diplomacy or coexistence. They immediately reverted to the prevailing spirit of the age: violence, forced labor, and wealth extraction. Cooperation was simply not an option in the face of greed.
Which brings us to the English approach. This was initially defined by two geographically and ideologically separate movements.
And first you have Jamestown, founded in 1607.
Jamestown was purely commercial. It was driven by the desire for quick returns. The settlers were a mix of adventurers, bankrupt gentry.
Even some criminals. All of them hoping to strike it rich and return home, not establish an enduring colony. Their single-minded focus was on finding gold or an equivalent commodity.
And that focus on quick profit nearly killed them all.
It did. They chose a poor, marshy location leading to disease from mosquitoes, the extreme humidity, constant conflict with the local tribes. Mortality rates were just staggering. It was essentially a survival camp for years.
The colony survived only because of one cash crop,
King tobacco.
king tobacco. It became the economic engine of Virginia. Its profitability was immense.
It yielded 5 to 10 times the profit of general farming back in England. This drew thousands of new settlers, but it created an immense labor demand.
And to meet that demand, they relied heavily on indentured servitude.
This was the first great migration engine. People who couldn't afford passage would sign a contract to work, basically like a slave, for a set period.
Usually 7 years.
Typically 7 years, and at the end of that term, they gained their freedom and a small plot of land.
And this brings us to a critical, painful moment, 1619. The first Africans arrived in Virginia.
Initially, the legal status of Africans was ambiguous. They were often treated similarly to white indentured servants.
Right, we have clear examples, like Anthony Johnson.
A fascinating case. He completed his servitude, gained freedom, owned property, and eventually employed his own labor.
Including white indentured servants.
But the economic forces of King Tobacco were just too powerful to allow that ambiguity to persist.
As the demand for permanent generational labor soared in the late 17th century, the Virginia Colonial Assembly began this systematic process of stripping away rights.
They implemented laws that made slavery permanent, hereditary, and based entirely on skin color. It shifted the institution from an economic status
To a racial one.
precisely. This was the crucial, terrifying pivot. It created the foundation for American chattel slavery, ensuring that wealth would be generated through a system of forced perpetual labor.
And it established the racial caste system that would plague the nation for centuries.
Now you contrast that with what's happening up north, Plymouth, 1620.
These are the Pilgrims, or separatists. Their motive was completely ideological. It was driven by religious fervor to flee persecution and establish these pure, uncorrupted religious communities.
They were seeking a moral, not a financial profit.
And when their ship, the Mayflower, landed in Massachusetts, way outside their intended land grant, they faced a legal void.
Right. And the immediate necessity of creating a functioning government led to the Mayflower Compact.
This wasn't a modern constitution, but it was a revolutionary idea.
It really was. All free men agreed to participate in the colony's governance. That simple, shared commitment. It planted the earliest seeds of American democratic tradition.
Despite the tragedy of that first winter half, the population died. They survived. And they survived thanks to crucial aid from native peoples like Squanto.
Which led to the alliance commemorated by the first Thanksgiving. But even this pursuit of religious liberty, it quickly calcified into rigidity.
Just 10 years later, John Winthrop led the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and his aim was to build the city upon a hill.
An exemplary moral commonwealth governed strictly by God's rules. The system they established was theocratic.
Which means voting rights and political power were determined solely by church membership.
And if you dared to challenge that moral structure,
You were instantly cast out. That's the fate of Roger Williams.
he was exiled because he insisted upon the separation of church and state. He argued that individual conscience must be superior to government power.
And what's so deeply ironic, and what speaks volumes about the birth of American values,
Is that Williams's idea, the fundamental value of separating spiritual belief from political authority, became a cornerstone of the future American Republic.
the earliest proponent of that core American value was deemed too radical and was immediately banished.
It just demonstrates that the path to U.S. ideals was often forged through conflict and rejection.
So by the mid-18th century, we have 13 distinct, often competing colonies.
Right. The North is centered on small farming, trade, and these tight religious communities.
And the South is built on vast plantation-based agriculture, which is fundamentally dependent on the expansion of slave labor.
They developed independently, but an external pressure from Great Britain forced them to unify.
That pressure arose after the 7 Years' War. Britain won the war, but was financially devastated.
So the Crown immediately looked to the 13 colonies to replenish its treasury. And that led to new taxes and duties: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act.
And the colonists weren't just angry about the money, they were angry about the principle.
Absolutely. They rapidly coalesced around a simple yet politically profound slogan: no taxation without representation.
Their argument was philosophical. Since they had no representatives sitting in the British Parliament, that body had no legitimate moral or legal right to levy taxes upon them.
This transcended mere economics. It was a crisis of political identity. It was a declaration that they were not merely subjects, but political actors with inherent rights.
And the resentment just simmered for years, finally boiling over in 1773 with the dramatic, defiant act of the Boston Tea Party.
The Tea Party was a direct reaction to London granting the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales.
Right, so the colonists weren't just protesting the tax, they were protesting the threat to local economic independence.
Especially the highly profitable local smuggling operations and the reduced tax revenues for local governance.
So in an act of open rebellion, a group of Bostonians, disguised as Native Americans,
And quite poorly, by some accounts.
they stormed the ships in Boston Harbor and pitched hundreds of chests of tea overboard. This was not a passive protest.
No, this was a physical, destructive confrontation with the authority of the empire.
And London's retaliation was swift and severe. They passed what the colonists immediately dubbed the Intolerable Acts.
This battery of laws closed Boston Harbor, crippled Massachusetts self-governance, and forced civilians to quarter British troops.
It was meant to isolate and punish Boston.
But instead, it served as the unifying force that galvanized the other colonies into outrage.
The First Continental Congress in 1774, they still sought reconciliation.
They did. They wanted their rights respected and the coercive acts repealed. But the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, where blood was actually spilled, made reconciliation impossible. The path to war was set.
And by 1776, the goal was full separation. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4th, 1776, was penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson.
And this document was the ultimate expression of Enlightenment philosophy. It declared those fundamental, breathtaking ideals that still echo globally.
It wasn't just a divorce decree.
No, it was a statement of universal human rights. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
A statement that was radical, explosive, and yet it contained the nation's profoundest hypocrisy.
And that is the paradox we cannot ignore.
The primary architect of this soaring statement of universal freedom, Thomas Jefferson, owned hundreds of slaves throughout his life and never offered emancipation upon his death.
He articulated the greatest vision of liberty while simultaneously ensuring that tens of thousands of people remained in chains.
The founders understood this contradiction.
Well, they did. But they chose political unity over moral consistency, burying the issue for the sake of founding the nation.
The Declaration provided the moral justification for war, but it took brute force and military genius to actually win.
That military effort fell to George Washington. He was leading a force of mostly farmers and tradesmen, a ragged volunteer army facing the world's most powerful military machine.
And they suffered terrible early defeats in New York. The cause looked hopeless as the winter of 1776 approached.
The critical turning point was born of desperation and just audacious courage.
Washington's famous crossing of the icy Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776.
For a surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton, followed by another victory at Princeton, it was brilliant.
These victories were tactically minor, but strategically vital. They revived morale, ensured the Continental Army didn't entirely dissolve,
And proved that the British forces could be surprised and defeated. It proved the revolution was still alive.
Of course, Washington's forces became much more effective thanks to figures like Baron von Steuben, who introduced Prussian discipline and training.
But even a disciplined army couldn't win without help. Foreign assistance was absolutely crucial.
The intervention of France in 1778, followed by Spain and the Netherlands, that provided the necessary military power, financial aid, and naval support to challenge Britain globally.
The French, in particular, provided the strategic resources needed to trap the British.
And that trap was sprung at Yorktown in 1781. General Cornwallis, expecting naval reinforcements that never came,
Was surrounded by joint French-American forces and forced to surrender his 7,000 troops.
The war ended 2 years later with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, confirming independence.
And the challenge now shifted entirely from winning a war to governing a union.
They won independence, but the question loomed. Could 13 fiercely independent, self-interested states possibly stay together?
The ideal was already etched into the new national seal. E pluribus unum.
Out of many, one.
It was an optimistic motto, but the reality of the initial governing document, the Articles of Confederation, was dire. It created a deliberately weak central government.
The states maintained almost complete sovereignty.
The federal Congress was unable to enforce its laws, couldn't regulate trade between the states, and critically, it could not levy taxes. It could only request money from the states.
Having just fought a war over taxation, they were paranoid about centralized financial power.
But this structure made the nation economically vulnerable. It was unable to pay its war debts, regulate a common market, or stabilize its currency. European observers were convinced the U.S. would quickly fracture into smaller, squabbling republics.
That crisis led directly to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787.
And the debates were immediate and fierce, primarily over how representation should be structured.
You had James Madison's Virginia Plan, which favored population-based representation, which of course benefited the large states.
While the smaller states feared being swallowed whole and demanded equal votes.
But representation was secondary to the existential threat of slavery. This was the fundamental crisis that required a moral bargain to achieve political unity.
Southern states insisted that their enslaved population should count toward their total population, giving them far more power in Congress and the Electoral College, while simultaneously denying these people any rights or representation.
The ultimate political bargain was the infamous 3/5 compromise.
5 enslaved people would count as 3 people for population purposes. It's important to analyze the moral calculation here. The framers despised it.
But they chose it as the necessary evil to prevent the Union from collapsing before it even began.
And what's often overlooked is the long-term structural damage this compromise caused. By counting enslaved populations for representation, it gave slave states immense and disproportionate power in Congress for decades,
Which enabled them to protect and expand the institution of slavery.
thereby ensuring the Civil War. It was the bargain for unity that ultimately guaranteed conflict.
With the structure established, the first major ideological clash immediately emerged. Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson.
This was a battle over the soul of America's economy and its government structure.
Hamilton, the pragmatic federalist, sought a powerful, centralized government and an industrialized manufacturing economy modeled directly after Great Britain.
His primary goal was fiscal stability. He famously argued that the nation needed a large managed debt to establish its creditworthiness and bind the interests of the wealthy elite to the new federal project.
Hamilton believed society was inherently divided between the elite and the disorderly majority, and that only by securing the unwavering support of the financial elite could the fragile republic be stabilized.
Which is why he championed the creation of a national bank to manage debt and centralize financial power.
And Jefferson, the Republican idealist, stood in stark opposition.
He believed in limited government, the primacy of individual liberty, and an agrarian empire built on the virtuous, self-sufficient common farmer.
He viewed Hamilton's national bank as a fundamental betrayal, a dangerous tool that would concentrate power in the hands of a few aristocrats, corrupting the nation and crushing the common citizen.
This was a battle fought intensely. We're talking vicious newspaper attacks, bitter political maneuvering.
Even physical brawls breaking out between partisans on the floor of Congress. The hostility was profound.
Despite Jefferson's fears, Hamilton's vision largely succeeded, and the central bank was established. Yet the system proved resilient.
Jefferson's election in 1800 was monumental.
Because it demonstrated that the new republic could absorb a change in power between fundamentally opposed political factions and do so peacefully. The stability of the government was confirmed.
With the republic secured, Jefferson could pursue his great vision for an agricultural empire stretching from coast to coast. This led to the 1803 Louisiana Purchase.
An accidental triumph of continental ambition,
Jefferson's initial goal was just to acquire the port city of New Orleans from France.
which was critical for ensuring Western farmers could ship their goods to global markets via the Mississippi River.
But Napoleon was desperate for cash following the Haitian Revolution and offered the entire Louisiana territory.
The whole deal cost $15 million, but it instantly doubled the size of the United States.
Jefferson himself worried about exceeding his constitutional authority, but the scale of the geopolitical opportunity to create this massive buffer of agricultural land was just too great to refuse.
And this vast unknown territory needed to be mapped, which led to the commissioning of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Their mission was diplomatic, scientific, and cartographic, charting the land, studying the nature, and establishing relations with the numerous native tribes.
And we must acknowledge the absolutely indispensable role of the Native American woman, Sacagawea.
She acted not just as a guide, but as a vital translator and diplomatic emissary. Her presence often signaled peaceful intent to other tribes and was crucial to the expedition's survival.
And its successful journey all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
This unprecedented expansion cemented the idea of manifest destiny.
The powerful, almost spiritual belief that the U.S. was destined by divine providence to expand its territory across the entire continent.
But this geographic growth exponentially amplified the one contradiction the founders had desperately tried to bury.
The spread of slavery.
The moment the U.S. acquired new Western lands, the conflict over slavery moved from a political inconvenience to an existential crisis. To understand why, we have to look at the economic revolution that had just deepened the South's dependence on forced labor.
That revolution, of course, is cotton. Before the 1790s, cotton was unprofitable because separating the sticky fiber from the seed was incredibly labor-intensive. A single person could process only a tiny amount per day.
Then came Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793. It changed the entire global economic calculation.
This simple invention could process 50 times more cotton than a single enslaved person working manually. Suddenly, the land stretching across the South with its ideal climate became capable of generating immense wealth.
This fueled the rise of King Cotton and created a vast, profitable empire.
And the soaring demand for cotton simultaneously required immense amounts of land, which drove westward expansion.
And immense amounts of labor, which drove the expansion of slavery. It became an economic imperative for the South, known euphemistically as the peculiar institution.
The reality of life under this regime was terrifyingly brutal. Slaves were forced to work from dawn until midnight under constant threat of physical violence and always facing the greatest fear, family separation.
And the sources confirm that literacy was strictly forbidden.
Driven by the slaveholders' fear that a literate slave could not be chained.
While the South industrialized slavery, the North was undergoing a different kind of revolution.
Right. The cold climate prevented cotton cultivation, but the North became the second cotton kingdom by processing the raw material into finished goods.
Early industrialization kicked off thanks to industrial espionage.
Samuel Slater, after memorizing the complex plans for textile machinery from England, which jealously guarded its secrets, brought them to the U.S.
Later, Francis Cabot Lowell took this a step further, consolidating the entire manufacturing process, from raw cotton to finished cloth, all under one roof in a single, massive factory complex.
And these factories utilized the famous Lowell girls, young women from rural New England. Their working conditions were grueling, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
But for many, it represented a unique opportunity for independence, an escape from farm life, and the ability to earn their own money for the first time.
But the revolution was far broader than textiles. Steel became the new defining material. Vertical integration, employed by titans like Andrew Carnegie, allowed industrial giants to control every step of production.
Centralizing unprecedented wealth and enabling the construction of skyscrapers that began to replace church steeples as the dominant features of the urban skyline.
This progress came with a staggering, often invisible human cost. The working life was highly dangerous. We know that railroad brakemen suffered the highest fatality rates, exceeding 1,000 deaths annually.
And the horror of child labor was rampant. We're talking 8-year-olds working in dangerous, bloody conditions in sardine canning factories. It's a visceral reminder of the human sacrifice underpinning this economic boom.
So the economic divergence was now total, a rapidly industrializing North built on free labor and an expanding South dependent entirely on forced labor. The conflict over new Western territories was no longer sustainable.
The first major attempt to manage this conflict was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It was a classic political deferral.
Missouri was admitted as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and a line was established, the 36-degree parallel banning slavery north of it.
It maintained the political balance in the Senate, but everyone knew it was merely a temporary postponement.
The political maneuvering only intensified the crisis. The 1850 Compromise included the hated Fugitive Slave Act, which legally required Northerners to actively participate in capturing and returning runaway slaves.
This was a direct, aggressive intrusion of the slave system into the free labor North.
And the reaction was immense. It forced Northerners to confront the brutality of slavery directly, massively inflaming anti-slavery sentiment. In response, networks like Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad became even more vital,
providing a literal path to hope and freedom for thousands seeking escape.
The final political fuse was lit by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It essentially invalidated the Missouri Compromise line, allowing new territories to decide the slavery question via popular sovereignty, a local vote.
This immediately led to political violence. Bleeding Kansas as armed pro- and anti-slavery forces rush into the territories to sway the vote.
And amidst this escalating violence, Abraham Lincoln rose to prominence within the new Republican Party, which was founded on the principle of opposing the spread of slavery.
His 1858 House Divided speech perfectly encapsulated the nation's fatal dilemma.
Lincoln famously declared that a house divided against itself cannot stand, arguing that the U.S. could not survive permanently half slave and half free.
The election of 1860, which Lincoln won without receiving a single Southern vote, was seen by the South as proof that their way of life was irrevocably threatened.
That perceived threat immediately triggered secession. South Carolina led 7 deep Southern states in leaving the Union, forming the Confederate States of America.
And when the Confederacy attacked the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, all hopes of peace died. The nation plunged into its bloodiest conflict.
The Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was a devastating conflict between the industrial North and the agricultural South.
The Union possessed immense advantages: a 3-to-1 population advantage, massive industrial capacity, and a far superior interconnected railroad network.
However, the Confederacy had a crucial advantage in morale and geography. They were fighting defensively, protecting their homeland and their way of life.
And for the first 2 years, the Union struggled. They were fighting a limited war, primarily focused on preservation of the Union, not emancipation.
But Lincoln quickly realized that a limited war would fail. The Republican establishment began pushing for emancipation, arguing it was both a moral necessity and a strategic imperative.
Freeing the slaves would cripple the South's labor force, which was essential for sustaining its war effort.
And the momentum was seized by the enslaved themselves. They often served as intelligence sources and guides for Union troops, or simply fled to freedom wherever Union lines advanced. This massive internal movement proved that emancipation was happening whether Lincoln decreed it or not.
So Lincoln formalized the shift on January 1st, 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation.
It was a strategic document. It declared slaves in Confederate-held territories free. And critically, this transformed the conflict overnight.
It was no longer just a war to preserve the Union.
It was a moral war against slavery, inspiring thousands of formerly enslaved men to join the Union Army.
The military turning point came in the summer of 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg,
which successfully repelled the Confederacy's final major offensive into Northern Territory. After General William T. Sherman's devastating march through the South, the end was inevitable.
The war concluded with General Robert E. Lee's surrender. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 750,000 soldiers died.
More than all other U.S. wars combined.
And the conflict resolved the question of unity and slavery constitutionally with the passage of the 13th Amendment, permanently abolishing slavery.
But the path to peace was instantly complicated by tragedy. Lincoln, who had urged the nation toward reunification with malice toward none, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth just days after the war ended.
And his vision for a generous, swift Reconstruction was lost.
The era of Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, immediately hit massive political roadblocks. Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, was lenient toward the defeated South, allowing Southern states to quickly implement black codes.
These black codes were a systematic attempt to recreate the conditions of slavery under a different legal name.
While they allowed basic rights like property and marriage, they savagely restricted African Americans, prohibiting them from serving on juries, testifying against white people, or even traveling freely.
They allowed local authorities to arrest black citizens for vagrancy, which resulted in forced labor contracts.
Congress, outraged by this subversion of the war's purpose, pushed back hard. They passed the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection under the law for all citizens and implemented military rule, dividing the South into 5 districts.
And this allowed formerly enslaved people to vote and hold office alongside loyal white Republicans.
For a brief radical period, what historians call a moment of revolution, freed African Americans actively participated in government.
They established the first widespread public school systems in the South and built infrastructure. And there's that small but potent symbol.
Formerly enslaved people actively exercising their right to walk on sidewalks, forcing whites to step aside into the muddy streets, the social order had been momentarily inverted.
But this democratic revolution was fleeting. It was undermined by rampant political corruption, the immense fatigue of the North.
And most lethally, the violent white supremacy campaigns waged by groups like the Ku Klux Klan.
The KKK was not just a criminal gang. They were a political force designed to terrorize black voters and loyal white Republicans out of office.
And the ultimate collapse came in 1877 when federal troops were withdrawn following a deal to settle a contested presidential election.
The failure of Reconstruction was devastating. It proved that 250 years of institutionalized oppression could not be reversed in a single decade.
The physical chains of slavery were broken, but the spirit of slavery persisted, leading to a century of legally enforced racial segregation and discrimination known throughout the South as Jim Crow.
Following the Civil War, the U.S. entered the Gilded Age, a period of breathtaking industrial and economic growth that just dwarfed anything that came before. The scale was dizzying.
The old measures of economic power became obsolete almost overnight. 25 years after the first textile mills employed a few thousand workers, the Pennsylvania Railroad alone employed 50,000 people.
Factories like the Homestead Steelworks could produce hundreds of tons of steel rail every single day.
This industrial output literally connected the continent. The standardization of the railway gauge across thousands of kilometers of track, accomplished in a massive coordinated effort in just 36 hours in 1886.
It made truly continental commerce possible, but this infrastructure came at a horrifying human cost.
The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains was a death trap. Landslides, explosions, extreme cold. The sources describe the tragedy of workers' bodies only being recovered during the spring thaw, left frozen in the landscape until winter released them.
The scale of industry created massive fortunes, but also immense social extremes. Industrial titans like Andrew Carnegie controlled every stage of production through vertical integration, centralizing wealth in the hands of a small few.
The richest Americans built opulent mansions resembling European palaces.
And while the elite lived in unparalleled splendor, the human cost was reflected in the living conditions of the working class. The wealth gap was immense. You had the poorest 12 people in cities often sharing a single, unhealthy, cramped room in what contemporaries called a soul-crushing tenement apartment.
The American factory and railroad system acted as a magnet, pulling in millions of immigrants, rapidly swelling cities like New York and Chicago into vast, diverse metropolises.
We saw two massive waves. The first wave, mostly in the 1840s and 50s, included the Irish fleeing the Great Famine and Germans.
And the poor Catholic Irish faced immediate suspicion and discrimination from the established Protestant majority, forcing them into the hardest, most dangerous labor-digging canals, laying track, and working in the docks.
The second wave, starting in the 1880s, brought millions of Southern and Eastern Europeans. Italians, Russians, Poles, Greeks, and Chinese immigrants.
They came seeking opportunity, often told that the streets of America were paved with gold.
But the reality was immediate and harsh. We have that poignant quote from the Italian immigrant who said when he arrived, he realized that streets weren't paved with gold. In fact, there wasn't even asphalt, and he was expected to pave them himself.
These new immigrants formed the necessary engine of the industrial machine. They took the heaviest factory and construction jobs, and they congregated in distinct ethnic enclaves like Little Italy and Chinatown, preserving their language and cultural identity while forming crucial mutual support networks to survive the harsh urban life.
As the U.S. completed its continental mission under Manifest Destiny, it had to decide its role in a world where European powers were rapidly colonizing the globe.
And the U.S. decided to look outward, ending its long period of isolation.
The pivotal moment was the Spanish-American War in 1898.
Fueled by aggressive yellow journalism and widespread sympathy for Cuban independence from Spain, tension soared, culminating in the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine battleship in Havana Harbor.
And Spain was immediately, though not entirely accurately, blamed.
The resulting war was brief and decisively won by the U.S. The subsequent Treaty of Paris forced Spain to cede control of Cuba and transfer possession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States.
This instantly transformed the U.S. into an overseas colonial power, and it sparked a massive, urgent debate back home.
Groups like the Anti-Imperialist League argued vehemently that occupying the Philippines violated the U.S.'s core founding principles, the right to self-governance and the consent of the governed.
Regardless of the philosophical debate, the geopolitical outcome was fixed. The U.S. secured crucial access to Pacific trade routes and definitively signaled its firm entry onto the global stage.
Isolationism was officially over.
Having become a world power, the U.S. was soon dragged into global conflict. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson vowed neutrality.
He viewed the conflict as an imperialist squabble among European rivals that the U.S. should avoid.
But neutrality became increasingly untenable. The British naval blockade hampered U.S. trade with Germany. Then, in 1915, the German U-boat sinking of the British passenger liner Lusitania.
Killing 128 Americans.
It generated massive outrage and strained the limits of U.S. patience.
The final abandonment of neutrality came in 1917. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, declaring they would sink any ship in their waters.
And critically, the intercepted Zimmermann telegram revealed Germany's secret proposition to Mexico, a promise of U.S. territory, including Texas and Arizona, if Mexico allied with Germany against the United States.
This was perceived as a direct threat to the homeland. The U.S. declared war on April 6, 1917, and American forces tipped the military balance in favor of the Allies, marking the U.S.'s powerful debut as a global military force.
However, the war's conclusion saw the U.S. recoil. Wilson championed his 14 points, including the League of Nations, intended to ensure lasting collective peace.
But the isolationist faction in the Senate rejected the treaty, causing the U.S. to retreat inward, avoiding the responsibility inherent in its new status as a major power.
Domestically, the 1920s were defined by the Roaring Twenties, a period of immense social and technological change.
The 19th Amendment granted women suffrage in 1920. The flapper generation symbolized a new, freer woman who was working outside the home and wearing comfortable, modern clothes.
Technology fundamentally reshaped daily life. Mass culture emerged via radio and cinema, creating a shared American experience.
And Henry Ford's assembly line made automobiles accessible to the middle class, which in turn spurred massive infrastructure projects like highways funded by gas taxes.
But this euphoria created a massive speculative bubble. Ordinary people began investing heavily in the stock market, often buying on margin, using credit to finance their bets.
Everyone believed the good times would last forever, generating immense consumer debt.
The reality crashed down on Black Thursday in 1929. The stock market collapsed, wiping out savings and credit. Factories couldn't sell products, debts couldn't be repaid.
Unemployment soared, reaching 13 million, one quarter of the workforce by 1932.
And adding to the economic devastation, poor farming practices combined with severe drought turned the Great Plains into the Dust Bowl.
This was an environmental and social catastrophe, forcing 3 million people, often called Okies and Arkies, to abandon their homes and become internal refugees, searching desperately for work and survival in the West.
President Herbert Hoover adhered rigidly to traditional policies, fearing that direct federal aid would destroy American self-reliance and encourage laziness.
His inaction was perceived as cold indifference, deepening the national crisis.
In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt took office, promising a New Deal, and most famously declaring that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
FDR's approach was experimental, recognizing that the government needed to aggressively intervene to save capitalism from itself.
His immediate priority was restoring faith in the financial system, temporarily closing all banks and then reopening only the solvent ones to prevent total collapse.
He then initiated unprecedented government intervention to provide relief, recovery, and reform.
FDR created dozens of new federal agencies that fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and its citizens.
The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed over 2 million young men on outdoor environmental projects, providing income and experience.
And the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, built massive dams, providing flood control and electricity to the poorest regions of the country.
FDR used his famous fireside chats on the radio to connect personally with millions of Americans, explaining his policies and renewing faith in the stability of the American system.
This personal connection cemented his legacy and allowed him to be elected an unprecedented 4 times.
As the U.S. recovered, global conflict loomed again. FDR opposed isolationism and covertly aided the Allies, knowing that Hitler's expansionist aims pose an existential threat to democracy worldwide.
U.S. neutrality ended violently on December 7, 1941, with Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, killing thousands of service members.
Germany and Italy, allied with Japan, immediately declared war on the U.S., plunging the nation into a devastating two-front global conflict.
And World War II exposed the deepest human depravity, primarily through the horror of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were systematically starved, shot, or gassed by the Nazis.
This transformed the conflict from a geopolitical struggle into a moral war for the soul of humanity.
Following FDR's sudden death in 1945, President Harry S. Truman faced the ultimate decision: to use the atomic bomb.
He chose to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's immediate surrender. The action ended the bloodiest war in history, but introduced the world to the horrifying reality of nuclear warfare.
The U.S. emerged from the ashes of the war economically booming and permanently cured of its isolationist tendencies.
But the defeat of fascism immediately led to the rise of a new, equally terrifying ideological rivalry.
The U.S. immediately faced a formidable new adversary, the Soviet Union.
Despite suffering 20 million casualties in World War II, the USSR, under Joseph Stalin, was a powerful military and political entity determined to expand its communist ideology.
Stalin rapidly seized control of Eastern European nations, lowering what Winston Churchill famously described as the Iron Curtain.
The subsequent 50 years became the Cold War, a global struggle of ideological proxy wars, espionage, and a terrifying arms race that spanned continents from Germany to Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba.
The U.S. strategy was containment. To prevent the spread of communism, the U.S. launched the multi-billion-dollar Marshall Plan,
An immense aid program designed to rebuild and stabilize Western European economies, ensuring they wouldn't fall prey to Soviet influence.
The ideological rivalry repeatedly turned violent in specific flashpoints. In 1950, when Communist North Korea invaded the South, the U.S. intervened under the UN banner.
Leading to Chinese intervention and a bloody, frustrating stalemate that remains unresolved to this day.
The world came closest to annihilation in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The USSR secretly deployed nuclear warheads in Cuba in retaliation for U.S. missiles in Turkey. When a U.S. spy plane confirmed the sites, the tension was absolute.
President Kennedy faced immense internal pressure to launch a surprise bombing attack on the sites. He refused, recognizing that such an action would be a Pearl Harbor in reverse and almost certainly trigger a full nuclear exchange.
Instead, he announced a naval quarantine of Cuba. The standoff lasted 13 terrifying days.
It was ultimately diffused through high-stakes secret diplomacy. The Soviet Union removed its missiles from Cuba.
The U.S. quietly removed its outdated missiles from Turkey, and Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba.
The constant looming fear of nuclear annihilation profoundly shapes American society and policy for the next generation.
But while America was fighting for freedom abroad, it was simultaneously forced to confront its deepest contradictions at home.
Despite the abolition of slavery a century prior, the spirit of slavery persisted in a legally segregated world upheld by the toxic doctrine of separate but equal.
The civil rights movement arose to challenge this system, led most famously by Martin Luther King Jr., who was heavily influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's principles of nonviolent resistance.
His philosophy was based on moral suasion and forcing the opposition to expose its own violence.
And key moments demonstrated the power of this strategy. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks' courageous refusal to give up her seat, lasted 381 days.
It crippled the bus company and demonstrated the profound economic power of nonviolent solidarity among ordinary black citizens.
The legal framework for dismantling segregation was laid in 1954 with the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education.
The court declared school segregation unconstitutional, arguing powerfully that separation inherently created a feeling of inferiority in black children, thereby denying them equal protection.
But Southern resistance was immediate and fierce. The violence reached a critical climax in Birmingham in 1963 when Police Chief Bull Connor ordered attack dogs and high-pressure fire hoses to be used against child protesters.
The resulting images, children being attacked in the streets, shocked the conscience of the American public and the world.
This public revulsion was the necessary catalyst that finally forced President Kennedy to submit comprehensive civil rights legislation to Congress.
That summer culminated in the March on Washington, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech to 250,000 people, cementing the movement's moral claim on American history.
The legislative victories followed rapidly. The 1964 Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act eliminated discriminatory voting practices.
But while these were historic, monumental victories, the long, difficult struggle for full economic and social equality continued, proving that legislative change does not instantly wipe away a century of systematic oppression.
For 40 years, the world was structurally defined by the U.S.-USSR rivalry. That dynamic began its irreversible breakdown in the 1980s.
President Ronald Reagan took a hard line against the Soviet Union, significantly increasing defense spending, including the ambitious Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars missile defense program.
This immense economic pressure strained the already collapsing Soviet economy to the breaking point.
The end came swiftly under Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, whose reforms, like glasnost and perestroika, loosened central control, unleashing internal forces he could not contain.
The powerful symbolic moment occurred in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved entirely.
This left the U.S. as the world's sole superpower, shifting its focus from containing a single ideological rival to maintaining overall global stability.
However, the legacy of previous foreign policy actions quickly produced unexpected blowback.
For instance, U.S. covert support for anti-Soviet fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan during the Cold War inadvertently provided the organizational and training infrastructure that helped pave the way for the rise of figures like Osama bin Laden.
This geopolitical complexity exploded into violence on September 11, 2001, with the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. It was the largest foreign attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor, forever demonstrating the devastating power of terrorism wielded by desperate non-state actors.
The attacks confirmed a terrifying new global reality: interdependence. Victims in the World Trade Center came from over 50 different countries, demonstrating that this tragedy, though aimed at the U.S., had profound, interconnected global ramifications.
In this new interconnected era, the U.S. continues to grapple with the long, painful shadow of its past persistent issues of racial and economic inequality and ongoing debates over immigration policy.
And we must recognize the evolution of environmental threats. The environmental movement received its initial vital spark back in 1962 with Rachel Carson's groundbreaking book, Silent Spring.
It detailed how chemicals like DDT disrupted nature and laid the groundwork for understanding the deep interconnectedness of human activity and planetary health.
But the ultimate challenge facing the global community today is climate change. Driven primarily by massive carbon dioxide emissions from industrial power plants and combustion engines, the steady, accelerating heating of the planet poses one of the biggest existential threats facing humanity, forcing the U.S. to grapple with internal policy shifts while maintaining its global leadership role.
So, if we look back at this long, messy, brilliant, and terrifying history, what does it all mean?
The American story is one of a continuous, relentless search for its own stated ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality.
Yet this search is constantly colliding violently with the painful contradictions written into its very DNA from slavery and the exploitation of indigenous people to deep-seated inequality and cynical isolationism.
The national motto, E pluribus unum ad many, one, is the final, perfect summation of this long journey.
It is the bond that attempts to hold together all these historical contradictions, the vast geography, and the immense array of diverse voices and struggles. The U.S. is a superpower that continues to navigate its role while constantly struggling to reconcile its present with its past.
History is not just written in textbooks, it is written by living it and by the policies we make today. We've covered the constitutional compromises, the moral failure of the Black Codes, and the violence that led to the failure of Reconstruction. If you consider that history, what specific, deep-seated historical contradiction, that painful necessity that was prioritized over an ideal, do you think still exerts the strongest influence on the political and social direction of the United States today? That is a question worth exploring deeply.